You're a royal physician in Madrid. The year is 1834. The palace corridors echo with hurried footsteps. The scent of incense cannot mask the stench of death, and whispers follow you like shadows. The king is dead, but your work is not finished. Summoned into his private chamber, you find Queen Maria Cristina weeping beside a silk-draped body. She turns to you, her voice breaking, and gives you a task so disturbing it makes your blood run cold. As you draw back the sheets, your eyes are not fixed on the lifeless face of Ferdinand VII, but on something else, something so grotesque, so unnatural, that it has haunted the palace for decades. The anatomical monstrosity that defined not only his marriages, but his reign. In this moment, you realize you're not preserving a man's flesh. You're preserving a symbol of a dynasty twisted by inbreeding, paranoia, and cruelty. A body as deformed as the kingdom it ruled, and this is where our story begins. Because behind the official portraits and grand ceremonies lies a truth history books never dared to write: how one king's most intimate shame became a national disaster. Before we continue, if you want to uncover more forbidden truths of history, secrets too dark for classrooms but too important to forget, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Together, across time and continents, we'll step into the shadows of history. The grotesque sight beneath those silk sheets was more than a personal curse. It was the perfect metaphor for an empire in decline. Ferdinand VII had not simply inherited a throne. He had inherited the poison legacy of centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Bourbons and Habsburgs had married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, generation after generation, weaving a bloodline that was less a tree and more a tangled knot of genetic decay. Out of that twisted lineage came Ferdinand, the embodiment of a monarchy rotting from within. Born in 1784 at El Escorial Palace, his very existence was marked by deformity. Court physicians whispered behind closed doors of a member so outsized, so warped in shape, that it seemed less human than mythological. The descriptions preserved in hidden medical records are almost surreal. Thin at the base, grotesquely thick at the tip, long enough to resemble a walking stick. What might be mistaken for a crude jest was, for Ferdinand, a lifelong torment. In an age when refinement was measured by restraint, when the ideals of classical beauty valued proportion and elegance, Ferdinand's anatomy branded him a monster. Servants snickered in corridors. Courtiers exchanged knowing glances. Even foreign diplomats wrote home about the humiliation of Spain's prince. From childhood, Ferdinand knew that his body was a spectacle, that his most intimate secret was also his greatest shame. This deformity did more than warp his body, it warped his soul. Each whisper in the palace became, to him, a dagger. Each bowed head seemed a smirk. He began to see mockery everywhere, and in his paranoia, he grew cruel. Those who served him suffered arbitrary punishments. A page who once glimpsed him undressing was not merely dismissed, but flogged, his family exiled from Madrid. No one could witness Ferdinand's shame and remain unscathed. And yet, this twisted inheritance was not just his burden, it was Spain's. His oversized, misshapen organ was more than a physical anomaly. It was an emblem of a dynasty grotesquely out of proportion, swollen with pride yet hollow at its core. Just as his anatomy was incapable of creating life without inflicting pain, so too was his reign incapable of producing stability without destroying those closest to him. Every detail of his deformity echoed in the kingdom he would one day rule, excessive, unbalanced, and destructive. A monarchy meant to embody divine order had instead become a theater of humiliation, a grotesque parody of power. Ferdinand's body told a story that Spain itself would soon enact, a story of promises deformed, of grandeur collapsing under its own unnatural weight. And as the young prince grew into a man, his abnormality did not fade into rumor. It became the center of his marriages, the terror of his queens, and the unspoken truth that haunted a nation. For what lay beneath the royal sheets was not only a personal curse, it was the anatomy of an empire's downfall. The story of Ferdinand VII cannot be told without first tracing the poison in his veins. His deformity was no accident, no isolated quirk of fate. It was the inevitable outcome of centuries of incestuous unions that had cursed Europe's most powerful dynasties. For generations, the Habsburgs and Bourbons had placed bloodline above humanity. Cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces. Entire dynasties twisted into themselves in the name of purity. What they called noble continuity was, in truth, a slow genetic strangulation. Jawlines thickened, minds faltered, and bodies withered under the burden of inbreeding. By the time Ferdinand was born in 1784, the damage was irreversible. He was less the heir to a throne than the living monument of a royal family devouring itself. His father, Charles IV, was a man too timid for kingship, preferring hunting dogs to governance. His mother, Maria Louisa of Parma, carried both the blood of Bourbon pride and the scars of that long genetic decline. Their marriage was not one of love, nor even political brilliance. It was simply another desperate knot in a tangled family tree. The result was Ferdinand, frail in spirit, deformed in body, and destined to turn private shame into public catastrophe. From infancy, the court physicians knew something was wrong. Whispers of the curse echoed through palace corridors, though never spoken aloud in official records. To the outside world, Spain still paraded its royals in silks and jewels, but behind those embroidered curtains lay a family unraveling. The young prince's body carried visible hints of his lineage's decay, and as he grew, his hidden abnormality became impossible to ignore. And yet, the tragedy was not confined to flesh. Inbreeding bred not only deformities of the body, but distortions of the mind. Ferdinand inherited more than physical burden. He inherited paranoia, insecurity, and the festering cruelty of generations who had never been told no. He learned early that power was not earned, but taken. That weakness must be masked with tyranny. Even as a boy, Ferdinand was marked by an unsettling intensity. He watched his mother flaunt her affair with Manuel de Godoy, Spain's true ruler, while his father turned away in humiliation. Betrayal was the air he breathed. Resentment was the language he understood. And beneath it all, his body reminded him that he was not normal, that nature itself had mocked his inheritance. The union of Bourbon and Habsburg blood had created a prince who embodied decline. Just as Spain's empire was collapsing under corruption and revolt, Ferdinand's very flesh was collapsing under the weight of his cursed lineage. He was the distorted heir of a distorted throne, proof that when bloodlines are chained to vanity and fear, the dynasty itself becomes a prison. And, soon, that prison would close not only on Ferdinand, but on all of Spain. As Ferdinand grew from child to adolescent, the whispered fears of his physicians became a grotesque reality. By the time he reached his teenage years, his body carried a secret that would shape his destiny more cruelly than any war or conspiracy. His anatomy, once merely peculiar in infancy, developed into a deformity that defied medical explanation. The royal doctors, bound by oaths of discretion, recorded their observations in coded notes, hidden deep in the archives. They described a member long and thin at its base, swelling monstrously at the tip, curving with unnatural angles, adorned with tissue growths that served no function. One physician, unable to mask his horror, wrote that it resembled a billiard cue, fragile where it should be strong, grotesquely swollen where it should be refined. Another dared to call it a club fashioned by a mad god. In a world obsessed with classical ideals, where the human form was measured against the sculptures of Greece and Rome, Ferdinand's deformity was not only abnormal, it was obscene. Male beauty was meant to be proportionate, dignified, restrained. Ferdinand's body mocked those ideals. What later centuries might confuse for virility was, in his own time, seen as barbaric, animalistic, a mark of degeneracy. The palace became a theater of cruel whispers. Servants who caught a glimpse while changing linens giggled behind closed doors. Courtiers, careful never to mock openly, traded subtle jests cloaked in metaphor. Even foreign diplomats sent coded reports back to their courts, noting with a smirk the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand's body, the one thing he could never escape, had become Europe's favorite secret. The boy felt every dagger. His paranoia was not born of imagination. It was fed daily by the smirks. the downcast eyes, the silences that said more than words ever could. He became convinced that every bow concealed a laugh, every respectful address masked ridicule. The humiliation burrowed deep, twisting into rage. When a young page once stumbled upon the prince while he dressed, Ferdinand's response was merciless. The boy was flogged until his back split, his family exiled from Madrid. The punishment was not about discipline, it was about erasing witnesses to his shame. No one, Ferdinand resolved, could see his secret and remain unscarred, but his cruelty did not silence the rumors. In fact, it sharpened them. The harsher his punishments, the more the court whispered, convinced that the stories must be true. The spiral fed itself, shame breeding paranoia, paranoia breeding violence, violence breeding more whispers. By the time Ferdinand reached manhood, his deformity was no longer a private condition. It was a shadow over the Spanish crown. It defined how he saw himself, how he treated others, how he understood power. To him, authority became compensation for humiliation. Cruelty became armor against mockery. And as the world outside the palace walls shifted, revolution stirring, colonies rebelling, Spain's future king was consumed not with governance, but with the prison of his own body. His deformity was no longer just a medical condition. It was a curse that shaped his soul, and soon it would shape the destiny of a nation. If Ferdinand's body was marked by deformity, his soul was shaped by the rot of his own household. He was born into a palace already unraveling, a family draped in velvet but corroded at the core. His father, King Charles III, embodied weakness. More hunter than ruler, Charles preferred the company of dogs and rifles to the burdens of governance. In council, he was hesitant, easily swayed, more spectator than sovereign. To the boy watching him from the gilded halls of El Escorial, his father was not a king to admire, but a man to pity, a figure mocked even by his own ministers. If Charles was weak, Maria Luisa of Parma, Ferdinand's mother, was the opposite. Domineering, ambitious, and voracious. She did not hide her appetites, whether for jewels, power, or men. Chief among them was Manuel de Godoy, the young guard who rose from obscurity to become prime minister and, in truth, the ruler of Spain. The queen flaunted her intimacy with him openly, a daily humiliation to Charles and a daily lesson to Ferdinand. In the echoing chambers of the palace, whispers claimed that some of the royal children were Godoys, not the kings. Imagine the young Ferdinand, already branded a freak by his anatomy, watching his mother drape herself over another man while his father turned away in resignation. Every meal, every procession, every ceremony became a theater of betrayal staged in front of the entire court. He absorbed it like poison. From his father, he learned that weakness invited ridicule. From his mother, he learned that love was a mask for ambition. From both, he learned that trust was a fool's delusion. The household became his first battlefield. Ferdinand despised Godoy, the man who wielded authority that should have been his father's. The man whispered to be closer to the queen than the king himself. He despised his mother for her shamelessness, for dragging their dynasty's dignity through mud. And he despised his father for enduring it all in silence, teaching his son that power was not to be respected, but to be seized before it was stolen. These early wounds hardened him. Where another boy might have sought affection, Ferdinand grew suspicious. Where another might have longed for approval, he nurtured resentment. He began to test power in small, cruel ways, punishing servants, betraying confidants, asserting dominance wherever he could. Each act was a rebellion against his father's passivity. A vow never to suffer humiliation as Charles had, but the irony was cruel. While Ferdinand vowed never to be mocked, the court continued to laugh behind his back. The deformity of his body and the dysfunction of his family fused into a single truth. He would never command respect by nature. He would have to carve it out with fear. And so, long before he wore the crown, Spain's future king had already learned the lessons that would define his reign. That love was treachery, that weakness was death, and that cruelty was the only shield against shame. By the time Ferdinand crossed the fragile boundary from boyhood to manhood, the damage was already done. His body carried the cruel joke of nature, his household had taught him betrayal, and now his mind began to twist into something darker, something Spain would one day know all too well. He entered adolescence with a simmering conviction. Everyone was mocking him. It wasn't entirely false. Courtiers whispered, servants smirked, foreign diplomats scribbled coded remarks about the Spanish shame. But Ferdinand's paranoia magnified every glance, every pause, every half-hidden smile. To him, the world was not merely indifferent, it was conspiring to humiliate him. The response was cruelty. He wielded his status like a weapon, lashing out at anyone who crossed him. A misplaced word could cost a servant his livelihood. An accidental glimpse of the prince undressing could lead to flogging or exile. His punishments were not about justice, but about erasing witnesses to his shame. Fear became his chosen armor, and he wore it ruthlessly. Even his tutors, tasked with shaping the mind of Spain's heir, found themselves navigating a minefield. He bristled at correction, interpreting guidance as insult. One chaplain recalled that Ferdinand would sit in silence during lessons, eyes narrowed, lips twitching, not in concentration but in simmering rage. He rarely forgot a slight, and he never forgave it. In time, he stopped seeking approval altogether. What he wanted was submission. The deformity of his body began to mirror the deformity of his soul. Where other princes cultivated charm to mask their flaws, Ferdinand leaned into fear. He believed respect could never be earned. It had to be beaten into others. The same paranoia that made him flinch at whispers also drove him to manipulate and dominate. And yet, beneath the cruelty was a festering insecurity. He obsessed over potions, alchemists, and miracle cures that might correct his anatomy, desperate for validation he would never find. Charlatans bled him of gold, selling rhinoceros horn powders, pearl dust, and exotic herbs. Each failure deepened his rage, convincing him that even medicine mocked him. The court began to see a disturbing pattern. Ferdinand did not simply punish disobedience, he sought to break spirits. He demanded absolute loyalty, yet trusted no one. He turned every relationship into a test, every ally into a suspect. To be close to Ferdinand was to live on a knife's edge, where affection could curdle into vengeance overnight. The boy who had once trembled under whispers had grown into a young man convinced he was surrounded by enemies. But instead of retreating, he sharpened himself into a blade. His laughter became rare, his eyes calculating, his words laced with suspicion. This was no longer merely a wounded prince. This was the outline of the tyrant he would become. Paranoid, vindictive, convinced that cruelty was the only path to survival. The twisted legacy of his body and his bloodline had found its final form, not in silence, not in shame, but in the will to dominate a kingdom the same way he tried to dominate his own demons. And Spain, still blind to the storm gathering in its palace, would soon discover that its future king's greatest deformity was not in his flesh, but in his soul. In 1802, at just 18 years old, Ferdinand finally stepped into the role that his family and country had prepared for him: marriage. His chosen bride was Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, his first cousin, a match that united two powerful Bourbon lines and, at least on paper, promised hope for Spain's future. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid filled with youthful optimism. She had heard her husband-to-be called El Deseado, the desired one, by supporters who longed for his eventual reign. In her imagination, she pictured a fairy tale union, a handsome prince, a glorious court, a life of romance and duty. The wedding ceremony itself fed these dreams. The cathedral blazed with candlelight, choirs filled the air with hymns, and Madrid's streets erupted in celebration. To the cheering crowds, they looked every bit the golden couple destined to restore their kingdom's fortunes. But if the wedding day was a spectacle of joy, the wedding night was a descent into horror. Maria Antonia, like most princesses of her age, was innocent of what awaited her. Her education had been religious, focused on languages and courtly etiquette, with only the vaguest references to marital duty. When Ferdinand's valet and physicians began preparing the bedchamber with strange cushions, oils, and implements that resembled surgical tools more than romantic accessories, her ladies-in-waiting were baffled. They assured her it was customary. She had no reason to question them until Ferdinand entered the room. The first sight of her husband undressed shattered her illusions. One attendant later described how the young queen screamed as though she had seen the devil himself. Maria Antonia recoiled, backing against the wall, unable to process the grotesque, inhuman shape of Ferdinand's anatomy. What should have been the tender beginning of a shared life became an ordeal orchestrated by physicians, as if intimacy itself had to be engineered. The special cushions were arranged to support Ferdinand's weight. Oils and laudanum were administered to dull her terror. It was less a wedding night than a medical experiment. This traumatic initiation set the pattern for their marriage. Ferdinand, already deeply insecure about his condition, interpreted his wife's fear as rejection, even betrayal. Each failed attempt at intimacy was, to him, proof that she despised him. To Maria Antonia, each encounter was a ritual of dread, prepared with drugs, endured in silence, and followed by tears. What was meant to produce heirs instead produced only despair. Her health began to unravel. The doses of laudanum required to endure these nights grew larger until dependency became addiction. Twice she conceived, and twice she miscarried, her body unable to withstand the trauma. By the time she turned 21, Maria Antonia was a shadow of herself, pale, withdrawn, her spirit broken by what she could never confide aloud. Rumors spread through the court like wildfire. Some whispered she had been poisoned, others that Ferdinand himself had orchestrated her decline to rid himself of a wife who could not give him an heir. When she died in 1807, the official record listed fever and delicate constitution, but the truth was far darker. Maria Antonia was destroyed by a marriage that functioned more as torture than union. For Ferdinand, her death brought no reflection, no remorse. Instead, he wore his grief like a mask in public, while privately, he moved quickly toward seeking another bride. To him, Maria Antonia was not a woman lost, but a failed experiment, discarded so that he might try again. It was the first in a series of tragedies that would define his reign. Women reduced to instruments of dynastic duty, broken under the weight of his deformity and paranoia. Each marriage a mirror of Spain itself, promising hope, but collapsing into ruin. Maria Antonia's death in 1807 left the Spanish court reeling, but not with grief. Instead, the palace corridors buzzed with rumors whispered behind cupped hands, rumors that pointed not only to tragedy, but to suspicion. The official story was simple. The young queen had succumbed to fever, weakened by her delicate constitution. But those closest to her knew the truth was more complicated. They had seen her decline, the laudanum bottles tucked beneath her pillows, the hollow eyes, the tremors that shook her hands, the nightmares that made her scream in the night. Some whispered that her body had been ravaged by years of marital trauma, that her miscarriages had drained her strength, that despair itself had killed her. Others whispered darker things. The most persistent rumor was poison. Many believed that Ferdinand, impatient with his wife's failures, had ordered her slow destruction. After all, had he not accused her of sabotage, of secretly preventing conception? Had he not raged that she despised him? And was it coincidence that the palace apothecary who attended Maria Antonia's medicine was found dead in his chambers just days after her passing, leaving behind a cryptic letter that vanished into Ferdinand's private archives? Whether true or not, the suspicion clung to him. To his subjects, Ferdinand was no grieving widower, but a man whose twisted nature had consumed yet another victim. And yet, if Maria Antonia's death stained his reputation, it did little to soften his heart. Publicly, he performed the expected rituals of mourning: black garments, solemn processions, carefully staged tears. Privately, however, his mind turned almost immediately to the question that had obsessed him since youth: succession. He had lost not only a wife, but the chance of an heir. Spain's future still hung in the balance, and Ferdinand was determined to try again. Behind the scenes, his physicians worked frantically. If a second marriage was to succeed, something had to change. They experimented with new contraptions, more sophisticated marital aids, redesigned cushions, devices of leather and silk crafted by the same artisans who made the king's saddles. These objects, half medical instruments and half instruments of torture, filled hidden chambers of the palace. Ferdinand's body had made intimacy into ordeal. Now his doctors sought to turn ordeal into routine. The court, meanwhile, watched in uneasy silence. Noble families speculated on who might be chosen next. Foreign princesses whispered fears about being offered to Madrid, where the first queen had withered so quickly. Ferdinand himself seemed unbothered by their dread. To him, Maria Antonia's failure was not his fault. It was hers. The next bride, he told his confidants, must be stronger, more compliant, more willing to endure what the first had not. It was a chilling preview of what his reign would become, a cycle of cruelty repeated again and again, each time dressed in ceremony, each time ending in ruin. Maria Antonia's death did not close a chapter. It opened the door to the next, darker one. For even as her body was lowered into the tomb, Ferdinand was already looking to the future, already preparing the stage for another marriage, another experiment, another victim of a king whose shame had become Spain's curse. Nearly a decade after the tragic end of Maria Antonia, Ferdinand VII once again prepared to take a bride. His choice fell upon another cousin, Maria Isabel of Portugal, just 19 years old, radiant with hope, and wholly unaware of the nightmare awaiting her. To the Spanish court, the marriage promised renewed stability, a chance to secure an heir and quiet the whispers that had haunted Ferdinand since his first wife's death. The wedding itself was nothing short of magnificent. The cathedral shimmered with gold, choirs thundered with hymns, and thousands filled the streets of Madrid. To the cheering crowds, Ferdinand and Isabel appeared as a vision of dynastic strength, their union a celebration of shared bloodlines and shared destiny. But destiny for Isabel would prove cruel. The true horror began that night. When the young queen entered the bedchamber, she was met not with tenderness, but with a scene prepared like a surgical theater. Cushions, oils, and strange instruments lay in place, overseen by physicians who whispered instructions as though they were preparing for an operation. Isabel's ladies-in-waiting had assured her that this was customary. She clung to their words, though unease already crept into her chest. Then Ferdinand entered. What followed would echo through the palace corridors for years. The first sight of his grotesque anatomy shattered Isabel's composure. Witnesses later recalled her cries, high, piercing, frantic, as though she had encountered a monster in human form. "Monstro! Monstru!" she screamed, recoiling in terror. Her shrieks carried down the marble halls, forcing servants to press their hands over their ears. The consummation was not an act of love, but of violence. Even with the bizarre contraptions devised by Ferdinand's physicians, Isabel's body could not endure the ordeal. Blood stained the sheets, and her sobs gave way to silence as she collapsed from shock. By morning, the palace was filled with whispers. The queen was alive, but changed. From that night onward, Maria Isabel lived in constant fear. The vivacious young princess who had entered Madrid with bright eyes and easy laughter became a haunted figure, trembling at her husband's approach. She developed a nervous stutter, waking often in the night with screams that echoed the horror of her wedding bed. Servants spoke of her pale face, her sudden fits of trembling, the way she flinched when touched. What modern minds would recognize as post-traumatic shock was then dismissed as hysteria. Ferdinand, rather than show concern, grew paranoid. To him, Isabel's fear was not the result of his cruelty, but an insult, a deliberate slight against his dignity. He accused her of weakness, of conspiring with foreign enemies to mock him. He began to spy on her correspondence, to monitor her meals for imagined poisons, to interrogate her attendants for signs of betrayal. The marriage, meant to secure Spain's future, instead became another chapter of ruin. Within 2 years, Isabel's health had deteriorated beyond repair. Emaciated, frail, and broken in spirit, she finally succumbed in 1818. The official cause was listed as nervous exhaustion, a phrase meant to mask what everyone already knew. She had been destroyed by her husband. Her death brought more shadows to Ferdinand's name. 2 wives, 2 graves, 2 young women consumed by the same nightmare. Yet to Ferdinand, Isabel was not a tragedy. She was simply another failure, another obstacle discarded in his endless, desperate pursuit of an heir. And so the pattern repeated, pomp and ceremony to mask decay, whispers in the palace to mask screams in the night, a king who turned his private shame into public catastrophe. Spain wept for its lost queen, but the true mourning belonged to a kingdom shackled to a monarch whose very touch left only ruin. The death of Maria Isabel should have plunged Ferdinand into mourning. 2 young queens gone, 2 hopes for succession extinguished. Yet grief, to Ferdinand, was never measured by love lost. It was counted in heirs not born. And so, scarcely a year later, the court arranged another wedding. This time, the bride was Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. At 24, she was older than his previous wives, intelligent, devout, and raised with a strict sense of duty. Her family, desperate for alliance, pushed her forward. She accepted the match with a stoic calm, prepared for sacrifice. What she could not prepare for was the reality of life beside Ferdinand. The marriage of 1819 lacked grandeur. Spain, battered by unrest, could not afford splendor, and fewer dignitaries attended. But the king's obsession had not changed. An heir was all that mattered. To Ferdinand, Maria Josepha was not a partner in life, but a vessel for continuation. From the very first night, the union felt clinical, not conjugal. The bridal chamber was staged less like a sanctuary of love than a medical ward. Cushions arranged at precise angles, bottles of oils, even surgical instruments nearby. Ferdinand's physicians waited in the next room, ready to intervene if difficulties arose. For Maria Josepha, the ordeal confirmed every whispered warning she had received in Saxony. She bore it with an eerie composure, tears hidden, screams stifled, while attendants watched helplessly. Unlike the queens before her, Maria Josepha turned to meticulous record-keeping. She documented everything: dates, techniques, physical pain, even her husband's shifting moods. In her eyes, the marriage bed became a laboratory, her body a subject of endless experimentation. Yet no formula, no instrument could overcome the grotesque reality of Ferdinand's deformity. Years passed, and the pattern ossified. Encounters were scheduled like appointments, monitored by doctors, conducted with the detachment of procedure. Ferdinand's paranoia grew alongside his frustration. He began to view Maria Josepha's journals not as a desperate coping mechanism, but as espionage. He accused her of sending coded reports to Saxony, of conspiring to expose him. What she saw as survival, he saw as betrayal. At last, in 1829, a fragile hope appeared. Maria Josepha conceived. For the court, it was a miracle. Could Spain finally see the birth of an heir? The palace buzzed with cautious joy. But Ferdinand, consumed by suspicion, suffocated the moment. Guards encircled her rooms. Foreign physicians were summoned. Rituals and astrological blessings performed. His obsession smothered what little peace Maria Josepha might have felt. The pregnancy ended in tragedy. At 7 months, she went into labor. The child, a daughter, survived only hours. Maria Josepha lingered, her body ravaged by infection and despair. Within weeks, she too was gone. Ferdinand's reaction was grotesque. He refused burial, forcing physicians to attempt revival on a corpse already decaying. For days, the palace stank of death while the king raved. When at last he conceded, he ordered a death mask of her face to join those of Maria Antonia and Maria Isabel. 3 queens, 3 masks, 3 women reduced to relics of a king's obsession. Maria Josepha's fate confirmed the grim pattern. Ferdinand's marriages were never unions of affection or politics, but cycles of trauma. Each wife became an experiment, each experiment a failure. And still, as earth covered her grave, Ferdinand plotted anew. Spain remained without an heir. His curse endured, and the kingdom, like his queens, would continue to bleed for it. By 1829, Ferdinand VII was 45, worn down by 3 failed marriages and a kingdom unraveling around him. Spain had bled out its empire in the Americas. The treasury lay empty, and unrest simmered in every province. Yet while the nation teetered, Ferdinand's thoughts remained shackled to the same obsession that had ruled his life, an heir to carry his line. But finding a 4th bride was nearly impossible. Across Europe, whispers of his deformity spread like wildfire. Young princesses recoiled at the prospect of binding themselves to the monster of Madrid. Negotiations stalled. Noble houses demanded impossible concessions. Ferdinand was no longer just a troubled king. He was a marital curse. At last, the choice fell on Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, barely 23, pragmatic and dutiful. She entered Madrid carrying a dangerous secret. Beneath her gowns, she was already pregnant, and the child was not Ferdinand's. For most monarchs, such a scandal would have been ruin. For Ferdinand, it was a lifeline. He convinced himself, or at least pretended, that the child was his. The court, unwilling to challenge him, bowed to the illusion. In 1830, a daughter was born, Isabella, proclaimed heir to the Spanish throne. Publicly, Ferdinand exalted her as the fulfillment of his prayers. Privately, he knew the truth. Isabella was not his blood, and the contradiction gnawed at him until it festered into obsession. He stared for hours at the infant, searching her tiny features for resemblance. His eyes, his nose, some spark of himself. He ordered portraits, demanded comparisons with his own childhood likeness, even interrogated scholars on heredity. No answer could erase what he already knew. Maria Christina's life soon became unbearable. The palace turned into a cage of suspicion. Ferdinand drilled spy holes into her chambers so he could watch her unseen. Servants reported her every word. Her meals sat untouched until tasters proved them safe. Guards rotated daily, for he trusted no one long enough to leave them in place. She moved through gilded corridors like a prisoner, her smiles rehearsed, her prayers surveilled. Even devotion to God became suspect. When Maria Christina lingered before the altar, Ferdinand whispered she was plotting with enemies. He stormed into her rooms without warning, desperate to catch her in betrayal. Ministers flattered his madness, courtiers lived in fear, and Spain's politics bent beneath the weight of one man's paranoia. In letters smuggled to her family, Maria Christina described life as a glass cage. Every breath counted, every word weighed. When Ferdinand intercepted those letters, his suspicions only deepened. Yet for all his rage, he could not let her go. She had given him, however falsely, the heir he had sought all his life. By the early 1830s, Ferdinand's body was collapsing, gout swelling his joints, illness hollowing his frame. But his mind circled endlessly around the same obsessions. Maria Christina's fidelity, Isabella's legitimacy, the betrayals he imagined in every shadow. He had secured succession, but at the price of dignity and sanity. His fourth marriage, like the three before it, was not a union of love, but a pact of survival. And as his health withered, a darker question filled the whispers of Madrid. What would become of Spain when the monster finally died? If Ferdinand's marriages had been a private stage of misery, his encounter with Napoleon Bonaparte turned that misery into an international performance. In 1808, as France's ambition shook Europe, Spain became just another pawn on Napoleon's chessboard, and Ferdinand, already fragile, paranoid, and scarred by his deformity, was thrust into a drama where even kings could be reduced to ridicule. Hungry for power, Ferdinand schemed with French envoys, hoping Napoleon would help him overthrow his father and rid Spain of his hated mother and her favorite, Manuel de Godoy. But treachery rarely ends as planned. Instead of a crown, Ferdinand was met with betrayal. Summoned to Bayonne, he was cornered, pressured, and humiliated into renouncing his claim. Spain itself was handed over to Napoleon like spoils from a game. From there, Ferdinand was sent deeper into France, confined in the Château de Valençay. Officially, he was treated as a guest. In reality, he was a prisoner, stripped of both authority and dignity. It was here that the French, freed from the veil of silence that had long protected him in Madrid, turned their scientific curiosity on his most infamous secret. Physicians examined him not as a monarch, but as a specimen. They documented his grotesque anatomy with cold precision, an organ monstrously disproportionate, scarred from crude attempts at self-surgery, dependent on bizarre contraptions to function at all. Sketches were drawn, reports compiled, and notes circulated quietly among medical schools. Ferdinand's most private curse was now a lesson in anatomy. For the king, the humiliation was unbearable. The whispers that had haunted palace corridors were now facts preserved in French archives. He begged, raged, and threatened, but none of it mattered. At Valençay, he was not sovereign. He was a curiosity, an exhibit dressed in velvet. Meanwhile, Spain bled for him. Across the peninsula, peasants, priests, and guerrilla fighters rose against Napoleon's armies. Convoys were ambushed, villages burned, and thousands died shouting Ferdinand's name. Yet the man for whom they sacrificed lived idly in French captivity, obsessing not over their suffering, but over his own body, scribbling letters about potential brides, and submitting to humiliating treatments meant to correct what nature had denied. Even Napoleon mocked him. To the emperor, Ferdinand was no savior, but un roi imbécile, a foolish king, unworthy of the loyalty his subjects shed blood to uphold. 6 years dragged by in this cage of velvet and shame. When he finally returned to Spain in 1814, the people greeted him as a liberator. Crowds wept, flowers rained down, and voices cried out for the desired one reborn. Yet the man who waved from the carriage was not the savior they imagined. He was hollow, shaped by captivity, carrying humiliation in place of strength. The French had stolen more than his throne. They had stripped the last fragments of his dignity. His secret, once whispered in shadows, was now catalogued in foreign hands. His reign would begin not with hope, but with paranoia, for he knew the truth. The world had laughed at him. Spain celebrated a king restored. In truth, it received a broken man, one whose private curse had already become a national humiliation. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, after 6 years of captivity in France, the people did not see the hollow man he had become. They saw a savior. To them, he was el deseado, the desired one, the monarch whose restoration promised a rebirth for their battered land. The homecoming was staged like a miracle. Crowds thronged the streets, showering petals beneath the carriage. Mothers lifted children to glimpse him. Veterans of the guerrilla wars saluted with tears, and church bells thundered as if heaven itself rejoiced. For a nation that had endured famine, invasion, and humiliation, Ferdinand's return seemed more than politics. It felt divine, a promise that Spain would rise again from Napoleon's shadow. But inside the carriage sat not a redeemer, but a man consumed by fear. Ferdinand had spent his years in Valence, not planning reform, but feeding paranoia. He brooded, obsessed, and shrank deeper into himself. Behind the stiff wave and rehearsed smile was someone preparing to rule, not as healer, but as tyrant. The illusion cracked quickly. Liberals who had drafted the Constitution of Cadiz in 1812 believed their king would embrace it. To them, it was a modern beacon, a chance to cast off absolutism. But Ferdinand saw only insult. The Constitution reminded him of his father's weakness and his own humiliation in France. Within months of his return, he tore it apart. The dream of liberty collapsed overnight. Reformers were jailed or exiled, newspapers silenced, and the long-buried Inquisition crept back into life. His paranoia seeped from the bedchamber into the state. Conspiracies, he believed, lurked everywhere, in sermons, in cafes, in whispered pamphlets. His solution was always the same: chains, dungeons, and fear. Thus began what history would call the ominous decade. While Europe cautiously rebuilt after Napoleon, Ferdinand dragged Spain backward. Prisons filled with dissenters, secret police prowled the streets. Torture was once again an instrument of governance. The very men who had shed blood in his name now found themselves silenced by the king they had fought to restore. His private obsessions bled into public policy. The same mind that devised contraptions for intimacy turned the palace into a machine of surveillance. Ministers rose and fell overnight. Bishops were purged, generals disgraced, all on the whim of Ferdinand's suspicions. Trust, in his eyes, was impossible. Fear, his only currency. The transformation was cruelly ironic. In 1814, the people had hailed him as the desired one. By 1820, he was cursed as the despised. The promise of liberation had curdled into the reality of repression. Ferdinand, however, saw none of it. To him, the suffering of his people was proof of their ingratitude. Liberals, conspirators, phantoms in every tavern, these were the enemies he chose to fight. His answer was always more spies, more prisons, more blood. Spain had placed its hope in a man already broken. What it received was a decade of shadows, where liberty was strangled, faith corrupted into fear, and the bright dreams of 1812 buried beneath the paranoia of a king who trusted no one, not even his own reflection. While Ferdinand VII drowned Spain in paranoia, a far greater disaster was taking shape across the Atlantic. The empire that had once made Spain the wealthiest crown in Europe, the empire of silver from Potosi, sugar from the Caribbean, and galleons laden with treasure, was unraveling, colony by colony. The flame had been lit during Napoleon's conquest. With the king a prisoner in France, the colonies of the Americas tasted self-rule. Creole elites, Spanish by blood but American by birth, discovered that they could govern without Madrid, and once freedom had been savored, there was no return. When Ferdinand regained his throne in 1814, he expected obedience. He believed the Americas would fall in line, bowing to the old crown as always. Instead, he was met with rebellion. From Mexico to Argentina, voices cried for independence. Simón Bolívar in the north, José de San Martín in the south, Miguel Hidalgo rallying Mexico. Their banners no longer bore Bourbon crests, but the promise of liberty. Ferdinand could not understand. To him, these uprisings were not born of decades of exploitation or Enlightenment ideals. They were insults, conspiracies aimed at him personally. His response was the same as ever: brutality. Generals were dispatched, villages terrorized, blood spilled in futile attempts to silence entire nations. But repression could not halt the tide. Spain's armies, underpaid and ill-supplied, faced not just rebels, but whole peoples, rising in defiance. Bolívar's ragged forces marched through jungles and mountains, defeating professional troops. San Martín led his men across the Andes. An impossible feat turned into victory. Hidalgo's cry of rebellion swept through Mexico, igniting peasants, priests, and townsfolk alike. One by one, Spain's treasures slipped away. Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Mexico, each broke free until by the 1820s, only Cuba and Puerto Rico remained. An empire that had once spanned oceans was reduced to fragments. The loss was devastating. For centuries, Spain's wealth had flowed from the New World. Gold, silver, sugar, cacao. Now the lifeline was severed. The treasury collapsed. Soldiers went unpaid. Roads fell into ruin. Famine spread. Spain, once the giant of Europe, was left limping in humiliation. And Ferdinand, he blamed everyone but himself. Ministers, he said, were traitors. Generals, cowards. The colonies, ungrateful children. Instead of seeking reform, he lashed out harder at his own people, filling prisons with dissenters, convinced that Spain's decline came from weakness, not his own failed rule. The irony was cruel. While Bolívar and San Martín built new nations, inspiring entire continents, Ferdinand cowered in his palace, scribbling orders, torturing reformers, and obsessing over conspiracies. His personal deformity had become the metaphor for Spain itself, grotesque, bloated, incapable of creating life, only destruction. To the courts of Europe, Spain was no longer a power, but a warning. Britain expanded, France rebuilt, yet Spain stumbled backward. Diplomats in London and Vienna spoke of Ferdinand not as a sovereign, but as a relic, a broken monarch presiding over the corpse of an empire. By the end of the 1820s, the Spanish Empire was gone. The silver fleets were history, the armies defeated, the wealth of the New World forever lost. Spain, once ruler of half the globe, was reduced to a humbled nation, bleeding both abroad and at home. And through it all, Ferdinand clung to the same obsessions. His paranoia, his cruelty, his endless fear of mockery. He had inherited a kingdom that ruled the world. He left behind a ruin. Spain had gambled its future on Ferdinand VII, and Spain had lost. As Spain's empire crumbled overseas, Ferdinand sought to build a kingdom of fear at home. If he could not command fleets across oceans, he would command whispers in his palace. If colonies slipped away, he would tighten chains around his own people. Madrid's royal court ceased to be a place of majesty. It became a maze of spies, interrogators, and hidden chambers, where suspicion reigned more cruelly than any law. From the moment he rose each morning, Ferdinand was haunted by paranoia. Enemies, he believed, were everywhere. Ministers plotting betrayal, courtiers laughing behind his back, priests conspiring in confessionals. To defend himself from these imagined dangers, he spun a web of surveillance that stretched from noble halls to kitchen servants. Letters were opened before delivery, conversations in taverns noted by informants. Even the Queen's private words repeated to the king. Nothing escaped his ears. In the suffocating air of the palace, a smile could be read as mockery, a pause in conversation as treason. Punishment came swiftly. Suspects vanished into the dungeons beneath Madrid, some resurfacing scarred and broken, others erased forever, names struck from records, bodies buried in silence. The same paranoia that once led him to flog a page for glimpsing his deformity now governed an entire nation. The Inquisition, abolished by reformers, was revived in his hands. Torture chambers, long thought relics of a darker age, rang again with screams. Scholars, priests, and liberals who dared to speak of liberty were hauled before tribunals. Guilt or innocence no longer mattered. Their true offense was existing in a world where Ferdinand imagined himself mocked by shadows. His suspicion poisoned even family life. Maria Cristina lived as though under house arrest. Her meals were tested obsessively, tasters forced to swallow dishes, then wait half an hour while she sat in dread. Some collapsed from fear, which Ferdinand took as proof of plots. Peepholes drilled into her walls allowed him to watch her while she prayed, nursed their child, or simply sat alone. Even moments of intimacy were interrogations disguised as affection. Ministers fared no better. One day, exalted with honors, the next, accused of treachery for contradicting a careless word. Ferdinand delighted in setting traps, feeding them contradictory statements and waiting to see if they dared correct him. The court descended into grotesque theater, where silence was survival, yet even silence could condemn. The consequences for Spain were catastrophic. Instead of healing after war and colonial loss, the nation suffocated under fear. Citizens lowered their voices, even among kin. Students whispered of liberty only in secret. Farmers cursed taxes with caution, fearing their neighbors might betray them. Spain became a country of masks, where faces hid dread, and silence carried more weight than speech. And yet, Ferdinand mistook this silence for power. He believed terror meant loyalty, that despair was respect. To him, the absence of open revolt proved victory. He never understood that the quiet he heard was not obedience, it was hopelessness. The palace that once symbolized Spain's grandeur had become a haunted fortress, echoing with screams, whispers, and suspicion. The king, once celebrated as El Deseado, the desired one, was now cursed as El Tirano. But even tyranny could not outlast flesh. Ferdinand's body, wrecked by years of disease and obsession, began to crumble. And as he weakened, his paranoia only deepened, dragging both court and country further into the shadows of his collapsing mind. By the early 1830s, Ferdinand VII was no longer the king who had ridden through Madrid to the cries of El Deseado. He was a broken man, his body swollen with gout, his hands trembling from nervous agitation, his mind shackled by paranoia so deep that even his courtiers whispered of madness. The once lavish palace had transformed into his prison. Ferdinand rarely appeared in public, preferring to haunt his chambers like a ghost. Heavy curtains blocked the sunlight, locks and bolts sealed every door. Guards rotated daily, servants were replaced weekly, for he trusted no one long enough to let them linger. Even his meals became ceremonies of suspicion, each dish tasted, retasted, and left to sit for half an hour before he dared touch it. The dining room often filled with silence as tasters sat sweating, waiting for poison that never came. Maria Cristina, his fourth queen, lived under the same suffocating weight. She moved carefully, her expressions measured, her words rehearsed, every gesture watched through spy holes drilled into her chamber walls. She confessed in letters to her family that she felt like an actress on stage, forced to perform serenity while despair gnawed at her mind. Those letters, of course, were intercepted and read by Ferdinand himself, who interpreted them not as pleas for help, but as evidence of conspiracy. His obsession with Isabella, the daughter he knew in his heart, was not his blood, only deepened the torment. He would stare at her for hours, searching her infant features for a resemblance he could never find. He summoned artists to sketch her face and genealogists to write reports proving her legitimacy, demanding science provide what nature had denied. To him, Isabella was both salvation and insult, the continuation of his dynasty and the living proof of his impotence. The king's paranoia grew more grotesque with each passing month. He stormed into Maria Cristina's chambers at midnight with armed guards, convinced he would catch her in adultery or treason. He accused ministers of betrayal for the smallest hesitation, then had them arrested or banished. Even family gatherings became tense interrogations, where gifts and toasts were examined as coded threats. Physically, he was wasting. Chronic digestive pain left him unable to eat. Tremors shook his frame. Insomnia hollowed his eyes. Court physicians recorded what they dared call cognitive decline, rambling speeches filled with accusations against enemies who did not exist, orders to investigate plots that were fantasies of his fevered mind. By 1833, Ferdinand was less a king than a captive of his own terror. He shuffled through corridors lined with guards, muttering about betrayal, clutching at relics and charms meant to ward off poison. The man who once commanded crowds now cowered before shadows. His court, once a theater of fear, had become a hospice for a monarch rotting in body and soul. And yet, even as death approached, he could not release his obsessions. His final months were spent not in governance or reconciliation, but in the same endless cycle: suspicion, accusation, surveillance, despair. Ferdinand had built his palace into a prison, and in the end, he was its most wretched prisoner. In the autumn of 1833, the reign of Ferdinand VII reached its inevitable end. The once desired one was now a husk of a man, ravaged by gout, hunched from pain, his mind slipping into fevered delirium. Courtiers described him drifting in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for his dead wives by name, sometimes issuing frantic orders to investigate plots that existed only in his imagination. The official records state that he died of complications from gout, but those who stood at his bedside knew the truth was larger than any diagnosis. He died of exhaustion, physical, psychological, and spiritual, a man consumed by the obsessions that had defined his entire existence. Death, however, did not end the grotesque story. It merely unveiled its final act. When Ferdinand's body was prepared, his physicians performed a secret autopsy. For years, they had been forced to treat his condition in silence, bound by loyalty and fear. Now, in the stillness of the death chamber, they recorded the truth. His anatomy measured 14 inches in length, with grotesque variations in girth from base to tip. The deformities were not simply external. Inside, the organ bore scars and lesions from decades of self-surgery, pathetic attempts to correct himself with knives, scalpels, even heated instruments. These crude experiments had left tissue mangled, rendering normal function impossible. The doctors wrote their findings in clinical detail. Sketches and notes that revealed a horror long whispered but never proven. This was not mere rumor. It was evidence etched in flesh. But what to do with such a revelation? To publish it would disgrace the monarchy. To destroy it would erase proof of their suffering. And so, the decision was made. The organ, preserved in chemical solution along with the medical records, was sealed away. The Vatican, guardian of so many unspeakable secrets, accepted the task. There, in hidden archives, Ferdinand's most intimate curse became a state secret. For those physicians, the preservation carried symbolism. They were not just storing flesh, they were preserving the embodiment of a reign that had twisted Spain itself. A grotesque body that had left grotesque scars upon a nation. Meanwhile, the palace mourned with pomp and ceremony. Black draperies shrouded Madrid, bells tolled, and solemn processions paraded the coffin of a king hailed officially as defender of the faith. Yet behind the pageantry lingered unease. Many remembered not a savior, but a tyrant, not a king, but a man whose deformities had warped his soul and his rule alike. Maria Cristina, left as regent for their daughter Isabella II, played her role with practiced composure. But even she carried the invisible wounds of her years in Ferdinand's glass cage. To her, his death was not just the end of a husband, but the release of a captor. The preserved organ, hidden away in Vatican vaults, remained a grotesque monument to his life, a reminder that power can be deformed as surely as flesh, that private shame can metastasize into public disaster. Scholars who glimpsed the records generations later describe them as fascinating and deeply unsettling, a window into how one man's curse became a nation's tragedy. Thus, Ferdinand's death did not bring peace. It left Spain fractured, its empire lost, its people embittered, and its monarchy clinging to a fragile air. His legacy was not of glory, but of ruin, a cautionary tale etched into both history and anatomy, locked in the silence of Vatican stone. When Ferdinand VII was laid to rest in September 1833, Spain did not awaken to stability. Instead, it stumbled into an uncertain dawn burdened by the chaos he left behind. His death offered no resolution, only confusion, and a crown placed precariously on the head of a child. Isabella II, still an infant, was proclaimed queen before she could form a word. Her mother, Maria Cristina, assumed the regency, forced to steer a court poisoned by decades of suspicion and divided by factions. The irony was bitter. After Ferdinand's grotesque, desperate quest to produce a legitimate heir, the dynasty now relied on a daughter who many believed was not even of his blood. The Spain he left her was shattered. The once great empire had vanished, its American colonies forever lost. The treasury was bare, its silver fleets long sunk into memory. Famine haunted the countryside, bandits prowled the roads, and unrest festered in the cities. Spain no longer commanded continents. It was a diminished kingdom, mocked abroad and feared only at home. Worse still, Ferdinand's death opened the door to civil war. His brother, Don Carlos, refused to accept Isabella's right to rule, claiming male succession as his due. The Carlist wars erupted almost at once, brother against brother, region against region. The throne, already fragile, became a battlefield, soaked in blood. Thus, Ferdinand's private failure, his inability to secure a clear, uncontested succession, became Spain's public catastrophe. The same deformity that haunted his body had shaped the destiny of his realm. A lineage incapable of creating life without pain had left behind a nation bleeding from wounds that would last generations. Historians would later brand him the most perverted king in history, yet the true perversion went deeper than flesh. It was the corruption of absolute power fused with weakness, paranoia, and cruelty. Ferdinand turned suspicion into governance, humiliation into law, and personal shame into national disaster. He showed how one man's brokenness could metastasize into civil war, economic collapse, and international disgrace. The Vatican still keeps the macabre relic, his preserved organ sealed in jars, accompanied by sketches and notes too grotesque for textbooks. Scholars who have glimpsed it speak of unease, as though looking at the embodiment of decay itself. Yet Ferdinand's real monument is not hidden in vaults, but written across Spain, in the graves of 3 dead queens, in the wasted blood of patriots who fought for him in vain, in the fractured inheritance of a kingdom divided. His legacy was not one of glory, but of warning. Ferdinand VII stands as proof that monarchy cannot sanctify deformity of the soul, that absolute power in the hands of the broken yields only ruin. His story is a reminder that private vice can become public catastrophe and that the fate of nations should never hinge upon the torment of one man's body. For Isabella II, the crown was not a gift, but a curse, an inheritance paid for by her father's obsessions and Spain's suffering. For Spain, Ferdinand's death was no end, but the beginning of a deeper decline. And for history, his reign remains a cautionary tale. The desired one who died a monster, remembered not for triumphs, but for the grotesque shadow he cast over a nation.